On January 28, 1986, millions of people around the world watched live as the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It was supposed to be a moment of triumph, a routine mission that included Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher who would become the first civilian in space, inspiring students across America who were watching in their classrooms. 73 seconds after launch, Challenger broke apart in a massive fireball 48,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 7 crew members aboard. You know that story. Everyone knows that story. The images are seared into collective memory. The twin solid rocket boosters spiraling away from the explosion. The stunned silence of news anchors struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The faces of families at Cape Canaveral looking up in horror. But there is so much about the Challenger disaster that you do not know. Things that were deliberately kept from the public. Details that were buried in classified reports or only revealed decades later. Evidence that suggests the crew did not die instantly in the explosion, but may have been conscious and aware during a horrifying 2-minute 45-second fall to the ocean. There are things about the warnings NASA received, specific, accurate predictions of exactly what would fail and why, that were ignored not because of uncertainty, but because of schedule pressure and political considerations. There are things about what was found during the recovery operation that challenged the official narrative of instant death and painless tragedy. There are things about how NASA's organizational culture transformed a known, documented risk into an acceptable anomaly, a process that has a name in engineering psychology and explains not just Challenger, but countless other institutional failures. This is a cultural failure with real consequences. And there are things that have emerged in recent years, new discoveries, new investigations, new admissions, that prove we still do not know the complete story of what happened that cold January morning. This is what they did not tell you about Challenger. The things that will blow your mind. The truth behind the tragedy that changed space exploration forever. To understand what went catastrophically wrong with Challenger, you need to understand how the Space Shuttle program was born and why it was compromised from the very beginning. When the Apollo program ended in 1972 with Apollo 17's return from the moon, NASA faced an existential crisis. The moon landings had been extraordinary achievements, but they were also extraordinarily expensive. Each Apollo mission cost billions of dollars. The rockets were single-use, built, launched once, and destroyed or abandoned. It was exploration, not infrastructure. As the 1970s began and the Cold War space race cooled following America's moon victory, Congress and the public lost enthusiasm for massive NASA budgets. The agency needed a new mission, something sustainable, something that justified continued investment. The answer was the Space Shuttle, a reusable spacecraft that could launch like a rocket, operate in orbit like a spacecraft, and land like an airplane. The vision was revolutionary. Instead of disposable rockets, the shuttle would fly again and again, dramatically reducing the cost per launch and making space access routine. NASA's initial pitch to Congress was ambitious. The shuttle would fly up to 24 missions per year, eventually becoming nearly as routine as commercial aviation. It would deploy satellites, conduct scientific research, build space stations, and prove that humanity's future included regular, affordable access to orbit. It was an incredible vision, but it was built on wildly optimistic assumptions and budget projections that forced critical compromises in the design, compromises that would prove fatal. The original shuttle concept envisioned fully reusable components, reusable boosters, reusable engines, reusable everything. But as budget realities set in during the 1970s, NASA had to make choices. One of the most consequential choices involved the boosters, the rockets that would provide the massive thrust needed to lift the shuttle off the launch pad. The safest option was liquid-fueled boosters because they could be throttled, shut down if problems arose, and controlled throughout the ascent. Those systems offered an abort option and more ways to respond if something went wrong. But liquid-fueled systems were expensive to develop and politically complex because they involved new technology and longer development timelines. Instead, NASA chose solid rocket boosters, cheaper to manufacture, simpler to operate politically, and familiar technology. They also came with a critical limitation that every engineer on the project knew from day one. Once a solid rocket motor ignites, it cannot be shut off. It burns until the fuel is exhausted. There is no abort option, no throttle control, no way to stop if something goes wrong. One engineer later explained, "With liquid rockets, you can shut down engines if you detect a problem. With solid rockets, once they light, you are committed. If something fails, you are along for the ride until impact." But that was not the worst compromise. The solid rocket boosters were massive, each one standing 149 feet tall, producing 3.3 million pounds of thrust. They were too large to manufacture as single pieces and transport by rail from the factory in Utah to Kennedy Space Center in Florida. So they were built in segments. 4 major segments per booster were manufactured separately, shipped by train, then assembled on site at Kennedy. That meant the boosters had joints, places where segments connected together, and those joints needed seals to prevent the super hot gases inside the burning rocket, over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, from escaping. The seals were rubber O-rings. 2 of them sat at each field joint, designed to press against the metal tang and clevis joint surfaces and create an airtight seal when pressure built up inside the booster during ignition. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the boosters, knew from the beginning that these O-rings were a potential vulnerability. They knew rubber becomes less flexible in cold temperatures. They knew that if an O-ring did not seat properly and seal quickly during the explosive ignition sequence, hot gases could blow past it, eroding the seal and potentially causing catastrophic failure. They documented these concerns. They conducted tests showing O-ring performance degraded in cold. They reported their findings to NASA. And NASA, facing relentless pressure to maintain an ambitious launch schedule and prove the shuttle program was delivering on its promises, classified these concerns as acceptable risks. This is where one of the most important concepts in understanding Challenger enters the story: normalization of deviance. Here is how it works and why it is so insidious. A problem occurs on a mission. Engineers identify it as a potential safety issue. But the mission succeeds anyway. The shuttle launches and lands safely despite the problem. So the problem gets reclassified from critical failure risk to acceptable anomaly. It happened, but nothing catastrophic occurred, so maybe it is not as serious as initially feared. The next time it happens, there is less alarm because it has happened before, and the outcome was fine. Each successful mission with the problem present becomes evidence that the problem is not really that dangerous. Over time, what should have been red flags requiring immediate grounding and redesign become normalized, expected, documented, and accepted as part of the risk profile. This is exactly what happened with the O-ring. On multiple shuttle flights before Challenger, post-flight inspections found evidence of O-ring problems. Engineers would disassemble the boosters after they were recovered from the ocean and find heat damage, erosion, and soot that had blown past the primary seal. Each time, concerns were raised in reports and engineering reviews, and each time, the shuttle had successfully completed its mission. Nobody died. The system worked, barely, but it worked. So the O-ring erosion became an acceptable anomaly, rather than a critical failure waiting to happen. By January 1986, NASA had documented O-ring issues on more than half of all previous shuttle flights. It was normal, expected, managed through documentation and monitoring rather than through redesign. We saw it as a trend that needed watching, one NASA manager later admitted. But we had flown 24 successful missions. The track record suggested we understood the risk, and it was acceptable. We were wrong. By 1986, NASA was planning its most ambitious launch schedule yet, 15 missions projected for that year alone. There was enormous pressure from Congress, from the Reagan administration, from commercial satellite customers, and from NASA leadership itself. They needed to prove the shuttle was reliable, routine, and on schedule. And then came the coldest launch conditions in shuttle program history. What most people know: engineers warned about cold weather. NASA launched anyway. Challenger exploded. What most people do not know: the engineers did not just express vague concerns. They specifically predicted, with shocking accuracy, exactly what would fail and how. And they were systematically pressured and overruled by managers more concerned with maintaining the launch schedule than crew safety. On January 27, 1986, the evening before the planned launch, temperatures at Kennedy Space Center dropped to 36 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, with predictions of temperatures in the low 30s by morning. This was unprecedented. The coldest previous shuttle launch had occurred at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The O-rings had never been tested or certified for operation below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor that built the solid rocket boosters, were alarmed. They requested an emergency teleconference with NASA managers to discuss whether to scrub the launch. The teleconference began at 8:45 p.m. on January 27, 1986, and lasted for hours. It became one of the most crucial and tragic decision-making sessions in NASA history. Morton Thiokol's engineers, led by Roger Boisjoli and Arnie Thompson, presented their data. O-rings lost resiliency in cold temperatures. Previous flights had shown O-ring erosion, and all those incidents occurred on launches when temperatures were below 65 degrees Fahrenheit. At the predicted overnight temperature, from 26 to 29 degrees Fahrenheit, the O-rings would be dangerously stiff. Their recommendation was unambiguous: do not launch until temperatures rise above a minimum of 53 degrees Fahrenheit. But NASA managers pushed back hard. They demanded proof that cold would cause failure, rather than requiring proof that it was safe to launch, a fundamental reversal of proper safety protocol that should blow your mind. In engineering, the burden of proof is supposed to work like this. You prove something is safe before you proceed. You do not proceed unless someone can definitively prove it is dangerous. NASA managers flipped that logic. They told Thiokol engineers to prove to them that it was unsafe, and that if they could not prove failure would occur, they were launching. The pressure intensified. One NASA manager, Lawrence Malloy, famously asked when they wanted him to launch, next April, implying that if they delayed for cold weather, they would never launch during winter months. Another manager told Thiokol executives to take off their engineering hat and put on their management hat, a statement that should horrify anyone who understands how technical decisions should be made. Engineering decisions should be made by engineers, based on data, not by managers, based on schedule pressure. Under this intense pressure, with NASA managers essentially threatening the contractor relationship, Thiokol management overruled their own engineers. At 11 p.m., Thiokol's senior vice president, Gerald Mason, polled his executives, deliberately excluding the engineers from the vote, and gave NASA the recommendation to proceed with the launch. Roger Boisjoli, the engineer who had fought hardest to stop the launch, went home that night and told his wife that it was going to blow up. Another engineer, Alan McDonald, was so disturbed that he refused to sign the launch recommendation, an act of professional courage that was ignored. NASA had the go-ahead from the contractor. The launch was scheduled for morning. The engineers who knew exactly what would happen could only watch in horror. Most people think Challenger exploded. They think the shuttle blew up in a massive detonation 73 seconds after launch. That is what it looked like on television, a huge fireball, the shuttle disappearing into clouds of white smoke and fire. But that is not what happened. And when you understand what actually occurred in those 73 seconds, And the nearly 3 minutes that followed, it will blow your mind. The actual sequence of events, reconstructed from thousands of photographs, telemetry data, and recovered debris, was this. At T plus 0.678 seconds, less than 1 second after ignition, before Challenger had even cleared the launch tower, a puff of black smoke appeared at the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster. This was the O-ring failing, exactly as the engineers had predicted. Hot gases at over 5,000 degrees were already escaping through the failed seal. But then, something unexpected happened. The leak temporarily sealed itself. Aluminum oxide particles and unburned propellant from inside the booster created a temporary plug in the gap where the O-ring had failed. It was pure chance, a lucky break that bought time. For nearly a minute, Challenger flew normally. Mission Control saw perfect telemetry. The crew had no indication anything was wrong. The temporary patch was holding. At 45 seconds, Challenger passed through max Q, the point of maximum aerodynamic stress, where the combination of speed and atmospheric density creates the highest forces on the vehicle. The shuttle shuddered as designed. Everything still appeared normal. Then, at 58 seconds, high-altitude winds created wind shear, a sudden change in wind speed and direction that added unexpected stress to the vehicle. At 64.660 seconds, the temporary seal failed. A bright flame appeared, captured clearly in photographs, jetting sideways from the right booster's aft field joint. This plume of superheated gas, burning at over 5,000 degrees, impinged directly on the external fuel tank structure. The external tank was massive, 154 feet tall, containing over 500,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. But its walls were thin, just millimeters of aluminum, because every pound of weight mattered for performance. The flame from the booster burned through the tank's strut attachment, then through the structural walls, creating breaches in both the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen tanks. At 72 seconds, the strut connecting the right booster to the external tank failed completely. The booster, still producing 3.3 million pounds of thrust, pivoted around its upper attachment and slammed into the intertank structure, rupturing both propellant tanks. At 73 seconds, the sudden massive release of propellant created an explosive combustion as hydrogen and oxygen mixed and ignited. But this was not a detonation. It was deflagration, a rapid burn of fuel that should have been contained. The fireball was not the shuttle exploding. It was the external tank's propellant combusting in the open air. What actually destroyed Challenger was aerodynamic forces. At 48,000 feet, traveling at nearly twice the speed of sound, the sudden loss of structural support from the external tank meant the orbiter was subjected to forces it was not designed to withstand. The shuttle broke apart, the wings separated, the tail section tore away, the crew cabin was ripped from the fuselage. But here is what will blow your mind. The crew cabin did not explode. It separated from the disintegrating shuttle, largely intact, and continued on a ballistic trajectory. This is the part of the Challenger story that NASA was most reluctant to discuss publicly. The part that families had to fight to learn about. The part that changes the tragedy from instant death in an explosion to something far more disturbing. When Challenger broke apart at 48,000 feet, the crew cabin, the reinforced compartment where all 7 astronauts were seated, separated as a relatively intact unit. It was never designed to survive this scenario. There were no parachutes for the cabin, no escape system, no way for the crew to survive an in-flight breakup. But the cabin itself held together. After separating from the rest of the shuttle, the cabin continued upward for approximately 25 seconds, reaching a peak altitude of roughly 65,000 feet. Then it began to fall. The fall lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds. During the massive recovery operation that followed, involving the Coast Guard, the Navy, and hundreds of personnel searching 486 square miles of ocean, The crew cabin was located on March 7, 1986, in 100 feet of water, about 18 miles offshore. All 7 crew members were still strapped in their seats. Investigators found evidence that fundamentally changed the understanding of what happened in those final minutes. Evidence that suggested at least some of the crew had been conscious during the fall. The evidence was this: 3 of the 4 personal egress air packs had been turned on. These emergency oxygen supplies were stored in a compartment, and they had to be unlocked, pulled out, and activated manually. This means that after the breakup, in the tumbling cabin falling through the sky, at least 3 crew members were conscious enough and oriented enough to activate emergency equipment. These were not unconscious reflexes. These were deliberate, trained responses to an emergency. Additionally, several cockpit switches were found in positions different from their pre-launch settings, switches that would only be moved if crew members were actively trying to respond to the emergency or attempting to regain control. The cabin had depressurized rapidly at 48,000 feet. At that altitude, without pressure suits, which the shuttle crew did not wear, unconsciousness from hypoxia typically occurs within 10 to 15 seconds. But the activated personal egress air packs would have provided supplemental oxygen, potentially keeping some crew members conscious longer. How long were they aware? Seconds? A full minute? Longer? We do not know for certain, and NASA has never released all the medical details to protect the families. But what we do know is horrifying enough. The crew did not die in the explosion. They died when the intact crew cabin hit the Atlantic Ocean at over 200 miles per hour, an impact no human could survive, after falling for nearly 3 minutes. When families learned these details years later, details that contradicted early official statements, implying instant, painless death, many expressed anger and betrayal that NASA had allowed them to believe something less traumatic than the truth. The investigation into Challenger was led by the Rogers Commission, a presidential panel appointed by Ronald Reagan. Their findings were damning. The technical cause was clear. O-ring failure in the right solid rocket booster's aft field joint was caused by cold temperatures, making the rubber less resilient. But the commission did not stop there. They identified the deeper institutional causes. Flawed decision-making. NASA managers had accepted a risk they did not fully understand and continued accepting it despite mounting evidence of danger. Communication failure. The concerns of engineers were not properly communicated up the chain of command, or were dismissed when they were. Schedule pressure. The drive to maintain an ambitious launch schedule created pressure that overrode safety considerations. Normalization of deviance. Repeated O-ring anomalies without catastrophic consequences led to treating serious problems as acceptable risks. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who served on the commission, famously demonstrated the O-ring problem during a televised hearing by dropping a piece of O-ring material into ice water and showing how it lost flexibility, a simple demonstration that made the technical failure comprehensible to the public. But Feynman went further in his personal observations appended to the commission report. He wrote about a disconnect between NASA engineers, who estimated the probability of catastrophic failure at roughly 1 in 100, and NASA management, who cited figures closer to 1 in 100,000, a difference that revealed dangerous overconfidence at leadership levels. For a successful technology, Feynman wrote, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. NASA was grounded for 32 months. The solid rocket boosters were completely redesigned with improved seals, heaters to prevent cold temperature problems, and numerous other safety enhancements. Management structures were reorganized. New safety oversight positions were created, with authority to stop launches. In September 1988, Discovery launched on the return-to-flight mission, STS-26. The mission carried a memorial to the Challenger crew. It was successful. The shuttle program continued for another 23 years, but the shadow of Challenger never lifted. NASA would face another tragedy, Columbia in 2003. that revealed some lessons had been learned while others had been forgotten. The Challenger story does not end in 1988. In recent years, new discoveries and revelations have emerged that continue to reshape our understanding of the disaster. In November 2022, 36 years after the disaster, a documentary film crew working on a History Channel series about World War II aircraft wrecks discovered a large piece of debris on the ocean floor off Florida's coast that appeared to be from the space shuttle. NASA confirmed it was from Challenger, a section over 15 feet by 15 feet, covered in the shuttle's distinctive thermal tiles, likely from the vehicle's underside. This discovery raised immediate questions. After the most extensive ocean recovery operation in NASA history, how was a piece this large missed for over 3 decades? What else is still down there? The official narrative said most of Challenger was recovered, but clearly significant pieces remained hidden. NASA announced the debris would be preserved and possibly moved to the facility where other Challenger artifacts are stored, away from public view, maintained as part of the historical record. New investigations and books published in recent years have revealed additional details about the decision-making on the night before launch. Documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests showed that NASA managers knew the risks were higher than they publicly acknowledged, but felt pressure from the Reagan White House to launch on schedule because a teacher was aboard and the State of the Union address was planned for that night, where President Reagan intended to mention the shuttle in orbit. Survivor testimonies from engineers who fought to stop the launch have become more detailed and more critical. Before his death in 2016, Roger Boisjoli, the Thiokol engineer who most strenuously opposed the launch, spoke extensively about the pressure he faced and the guilt he carried for decades, believing he had not fought hard enough, even though he had done everything professionally possible to stop the disaster. Modern engineering analysis has confirmed that the engineers' predictions were accurate. On the morning of January 28, 1986, at temperatures around 28 to 29 degrees Fahrenheit, the O-rings had essentially no chance of sealing properly. The disaster was not just likely, it was nearly inevitable under those conditions. And perhaps most significantly, institutional analysis comparing Challenger to other engineering disasters has solidified the concept of normalization and deviance as a critical warning sign across industries. When organizations start treating anomalies as normal, catastrophe becomes a statistical certainty. When you learn the full truth about Challenger, the specific, accurate warnings that were ignored, the engineers who predicted exactly what would fail and were overruled, the evidence that the crew did not die instantly, but fell conscious for nearly 3 minutes, the fact that NASA knew the O-rings were a critical vulnerability and flew anyway, and the discovery of major debris 36 years later, proving we still do not have the complete picture, it fundamentally changes how you understand the disaster. This was not a tragic accident caused by unforeseen technical failure. This was a preventable catastrophe caused by institutional choices that valued schedule over safety, by managers who demanded proof of danger rather than proof of safety, and by a culture that normalized risk until it became routine. The real villain was not cold weather or faulty O-rings. It was an organizational culture that had convinced itself that 24 successful missions meant the 25th was guaranteed. It was a system that punished engineers for raising concerns and rewarded managers for meeting deadlines. It was the normalization of deviance, the insidious process by which serious problems become acceptable risks. 7 people died: Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. They deserved better. They deserved a space agency that valued their lives over launch schedules. They deserved managers who listened to engineers. They deserved a system that proved safety rather than demanded proof of danger. They did not get any of that. On a cold January morning, they paid the price for institutional failures that everyone involved knew about and chose to ignore. That is the truth about Challenger that should blow your mind. It did not have to happen. Every element was predictable, documented, and avoidable. It only happened because people who knew better made conscious decisions to proceed despite clear warnings about exactly what would go wrong. The engineers knew. NASA knew. 73 seconds after launch, the world learned what happens when institutional pressure overrides engineering judgment. The Challenger disaster is a permanent reminder that in complex systems, normalization of deviance kills. Schedule pressure cannot override safety. When engineers raise red flags, they must be heard, not dismissed by managers concerned about timelines and optics. These lessons were supposedly learned. NASA reformed. New protocols were implemented. Safety culture was emphasized. And yet, 17 years later, Columbia broke apart during re-entry, killing 7 more astronauts, in a disaster caused by eerily similar institutional failures, known problems that had been normalized, engineers whose concerns were dismissed, a culture where schedule and budget pressures overrode safety. The Challenger disaster should blow your mind, not just because of what happened in 1986, but because it revealed something fundamental about how institutions fail, about how intelligent, well-meaning people can make catastrophically bad decisions, about how success breeds dangerous overconfidence, about how the pressure to maintain schedules and meet expectations can override the most basic safety principles, and about how 7 people who trusted an agency to keep them safe climbed into a spacecraft built on compromises and acceptable risks, and died not because of unforeseen failure, but because of institutional choices that valued expedience over their lives. That is the truth. The things you did not know, the details that will blow your mind. Challenger did not just explode. It broke apart because of a known, predicted, documented failure that NASA chose to accept as an acceptable risk. The crew did not die instantly. They fell for nearly 3 minutes, some possibly conscious, before impact killed them. The warnings were not vague. They were specific, accurate, and deliberately ignored. We're still finding pieces of Challenger on the ocean floor 36 years later, proving the story is not complete. These are the things about the Challenger disaster that will blow your mind. And they are the things we need to remember, not just to honor the crew, but to ensure institutional pressure never again overrides the warnings of those who know the truth.